same time learn which alternatives kind of missed the mark. So that's really what we want to go over with you today, kind of at a high clip. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Lauren to kind of go over some meeting logistics.
Yeah, thank you, Dave. So before I go into logistics, I just want to say I'm so grateful to those of you who scheduled calls with me to talk about how the CAG experience has been for you so far. We're just really glad to be at this point in the process, and we know that there's still a long road ahead. So it's just really important to make sure that this is working for everyone. So far, I've talked to 13 members of the CAG, and I encourage any of you who I haven't spoken to yet to book a conversation at the link that I sent, and we can send that out again after the meeting, and just get a hold of me in the coming weeks. I would love to connect with each and every one of you. I'll also say welcome to the community members who are in attendance today, who aren't part of the CAG. And once again, you'll be in listen only mode today, and you won't have access to the comments in the chat box. But if you do have comments or questions or other thoughts that you'd like to share, as always, we invite you to send them to our project inbox, which Laura will put in the chat. So moving on, let's see. We, just for reference, we log any comments that go to the project inbox. We log that in our public comment log, which we share with all advisory groups ahead of these meetings. And I'll just say a reminder that these meetings are recorded and will be posted to the project website for anyone who couldn't attend live. I know that we're all familiar with Zoom at this point. So here are just a few friendly reminders about the features that we'll be using during the meeting. And as always, I will ask you to please make sure the chat box is working for you by adding your name and the community you represent in the chat. Go ahead and pull that up and make sure that you can see everybody's responses. All right. So if you, for any reason, can't see the chats coming through in the chat box, or if I am coming in fuzzy for you or anything like that, you can call the number on the screen right here. Laura Labissiner-Miller, who you'll see in the panelists list, will be moderating questions and comments tonight. So if there's any question or comment that you don't want to share in the chat to everyone, you can send them directly to Laura. Otherwise, please do select everyone instead of hosts and panelists so that the folks who are on the line who are not CAG members can see what we're saying in the chat. And we will do our best to read everything that's sent through the chat aloud so you don't have to track that if that's distracting to you. And if we're going too fast, please let one of us know and we will circle back. So in our meeting today, we're going to explain how the feedback from this group and also from the technical advisory group was incorporated into the alternatives and screening criteria that went into level 1 screening. And then we'll discuss the level 1 screening report and the results. And after we go through the results, we'll have time for questions and then get into our approach for broader community engagement to share out our work so far. So the flow of the meeting will be to cover some updates, talk through the updates we made to the level 1 approach, review the level 1 report, and then talk about community meetings. And this chart you see on the screen just generally shows where we are reviewing the level 1 screening results tonight and where we're going next with level 2, and then ultimately the draft Pell study report. So before I go on, are there any questions about the agenda or what we're doing together tonight? All right. So next up, we sent out the updated public comment log for you to review ahead of the meeting. I don't believe there were a whole bunch of comments since our last meeting, but we share these to make sure that these conversations are informed by feedback from the broader community, so we can stay accountable to tracking and considering and responding to every comment that comes to us. I know that was sent out few days ago. Has anybody had a chance to review it or have any questions about the log? I see Scott, your hand is up.
Yes, I noticed that it said that it was as of comments since April 2nd, but there were comments before April 2nd that were not highlighted that were subsequent to the last meeting.
Okay, that sounds like possibly just an error on our part.
But I think it should be highlighted.
Yeah, okay. We'll go back and look and make sure that we've got all of the comments highlighted that ought to be.
Thank you.
Thank you for noting that. Any other questions about the comment log before we move into our meeting material? All right, well, we can always circle back if it comes up. So at this point, I'm going to hand it over to Hadley to start talking about how we incorporated your feedback from the last meeting.
Thanks, Lauren. So I want to start by just checking in to make sure everybody received the level 1 screening report. I know you might not have had time to read the whole thing, but if you didn't receive it, if you want to just pop a note in the chat to Laura, she can make sure to email that to you. That's kind of an important document that's really what we're going to spend most of tonight talking about, and it's a really important milestone that we've gotten this far in the process. So I want to make sure you all have that so you can read it after the meeting if you haven't already. As Dave said at the beginning, we're really grateful for all of your honest feedback from the last meeting. I know that meeting ran a little long and it was kind of a more intense conversation that we've had at some of our previous meetings, but we really appreciate it. And it was really, really helpful to us as we made decisions on how to proceed with the process and with the level 1 screening milestone. So after hearing from you and from the technical advisory group that we met with the week after we met with you last time, we took a step back and made some adjustments to the alternatives and to the screening criteria to incorporate your feedback and feedback from our agency partners who are on the technical advisory group. We know you're excited to get into this. I think many of you mentioned in your meetings with Lauren and in our meeting last time that you really wanted more information and more details and wanted to dive deeper into the process. So hopefully we can start that tonight. At the last meeting, we heard several kind of key themes. The first one was that the level 1 screening criteria that we presented to you as a draft was not comprehensive enough. If you'll remember, it was about 5 points, all of which were related to the purpose statements of the project. You wanted more detailed screening criteria to screen out alternatives. The second point we heard was that there were too many of the alternatives seemed to have major flaws, but that you didn't feel like you had enough information yet to screen them out. And that was particularly around our conversation about alternatives that moved the terminal to another location. Some alternatives needed operational elements sort of incorporated into them rather than considering those supplemental. And by that, we mean things like exploring a good to go fare collection system or advanced ticketing or some of the other things that could make a alternative work better by including operational elements. We had, you heard that it was difficult to give feedback on the alternatives without having information from the level 1 analysis. And we heard that both from you and our technical advisory group members. And we heard that you felt that most of the important issues are going to come in level 2 when we really dive into the details and start to develop these alternatives more. So there was sort of a lot of eagerness to just get there sooner and to begin the conversation about the issues that are most important to you all. So we heard that loud and clear, which is one reason we're coming back to you with a lot of information tonight and where we went ahead and did the initial level 1 screening for this meeting. So based on that, we've updated the level 1 screening. And we heard that the alternative locations didn't seem feasible. We heard that sort of general consensus at the last meeting, but we also heard that there wasn't enough information provided for everybody to feel 100% comfortable screening them out before conducting the level 1 screening itself. And on the screen now, you'll see the original screening criteria that we presented to you last time as a reminder. So you can see how in a few minutes we'll share the revised criteria. You can see the changes that we incorporated. We also reorganized the alternatives to add several variations on the 80-car dock, which included adding good to go and advanced ticketing as integral to the alternative rather than as listed on the side as supplemental elements. You'll recall that we already had 3 alternatives with different vehicle holding options, which assumed an 80 vehicle dock. So these are all now listed as alternatives A1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So just as a note, if you were following along or taking notes on certain alternatives last time, we've re-lettered the alternatives. It's all the same alternatives, but they just have different names. And that was just to kind of organize it better and make it easier for people to see the alternatives that have the same size dock. Finally, we completed the level 1 screening ahead of our initial schedule so that we're able to bring that information back to you and to our other advisory groups that we'll be meeting with in the next 2 weeks in order to provide enough information to really foster the meaningful conversations that you said you wanted to have. So first, I will talk through the updated screening criteria, and then Mark is going to talk through the alternatives and how they were screened. So now, compared to the slide we just had, you'll see the revised level 1 screening criteria. The ones highlighted in green are the new criteria that we added. And this is based on comments that you made, and then also based on comments from our advisory group that wanted to make sure we were considering really important criteria at this level and not waiting to look at that criteria later on in the process. So we've gone from just a few really basic criteria to a much bigger list. And I think at this point, I'll pause. Actually, I'm going to read through them just to make sure that everyone can follow along. And for our video participants, ability to meet the requirements for structural reliability, ability to accommodate projected sea level rise, the ability for an alternative to improve operational efficiency, for example, minimizing dwell time, the amount of time the ferry stays in the dock, processing vehicles more efficiently, maintaining on-time performance, the ability for an alternative to reduce the number of conflict points between traffic modes, which includes safety for people walking, driving, biking, the ability to meet our operational requirements, and the ability to keep to the current sailing schedule using the 324-car Issaquah class ferries as we discussed last time, and keeping the same general level of service to Vashon and Southworth. So those are the criteria that we had last time that are based on the project's purpose and need. And then we added the ability to enhance multimodal connections, meaning connections to transit, and allow for growth in walk-ons, bicycles, and van pools. The ability to avoid changes to parks and recreational areas, so impacts to parks, and that's based on section 4F and 6F. Ability to avoid changes to traffic circulable streets, minimize impacts to how the traffic works on the streets around the ferry terminal. Project cost and the total cost, including design, planning, acquisition of new right-of-way, risk, and construction. Alignment with the current project schedule. We know that the big reason for this project is the urgent preservation needs at the dock and the project schedule and how the funding is currently allocated. So that's an important consideration. Amount of additional right-of-way that would be needed beyond the existing terminal footprint, which has a cost, but also sort of the amount of time to purchase that right-of-way or find that right-of-way. Permitting and coordination, level of coordination needed with tribes and other partners, and the permitting complexity of each alternative. And then changes to existing policies and regulations that could have an impact on the project schedule or risk project delay. So those are all of the screening criteria that we used when we screened the alternatives at level 1. We heard from you as well, several of you, the importance of including environmental criteria. So while the permitting and coordination bullet point gets at that a little bit, assessing the environmental impacts and sort of the level of permitting complexity, we will be doing a more in-depth evaluation of potential impacts to the environment, including Fauntleroy Creek and other resources near the terminal. And that will all be part of the level 2 screening and then the subsequent NEPA evaluation process. So before we share the results of level 1 and how we screened the alternatives, are there any questions about this criteria, the new criteria, or how we revised the screening criteria?
I see Frank's hand is up. Go ahead, Frank.
I just wanted to say, Hadley, not so much a question as a comment. Nicely done to add additional information. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Frank. Go ahead, Victoria.
There. I agree with Frank. Nicely done. Are we going to go into more detail on some of these and discuss them a little further? Because I have some questions on some of these.
So we are going to discuss all of the findings based on these criteria, but if you have a question about what's included or kind of what level,
No, I can wait then.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks. There will be more.
Thanks, Susan. I see your comment in the chat that you think these are helpful.
Great.
So
Anyone else?
we can circle back to this after Mark goes through the screening itself and how we applied this criteria to screening the alternatives. So if there are further questions, we can get to it later in the meeting. Okay, Mark, I think I'm going to hand it off to you.
All right, thanks, Hadley. So let's begin with just a recap of the level 1 alternatives. As Hadley shared, we've modified the list, added some, and revised the lettering so that it's easier to follow. So you'll see the A series, those are all an 80 dock size terminal at the current location, and they're matched with different operational elements based on the feedback that, as Hadley said, you had given us, that you wanted to see some more specificity of an alternative having that operational element integral, and then that'll allow us to kind of differentiate them as we continue to evaluate them. On the right side of the screen, you see the previous alternatives. Those lettering stayed the same. So B, C, D, E, F, and G, all the way through. Those are the same as we've shared before, with either different dock sizes at the current location or alternative terminal locations. Go to the next slide. And just in a little more specificity for a couple of the alternatives. So we've added 2 alternatives with the same dock size that bring an operational element into the definition of the alternative. So that meant that A1 is replacing the dock at the same size and same location without those operational elements. So you could think of it as just simply replacing the terminal to meet seismic and sea level, but no operational elements. And then A2 is same dock size, but adding good to go fare payment as that operational element that's core to the definition of the project. And an alternative A3 is again the same dock size and adding the advanced ticketing to that alternative. Looks like we have a couple questions. I didn't see who came up first. So
Okay.
Judy, let's start with you. Or Lauren, if you want to facilitate.
Sorry, I was having a hard time coming off mute. Yeah, we can go ahead, Judy.
Please refresh my memory, the difference between good to go and advanced ticketing.
Sure, Judy. So good to go is, it's the fare payment system that WSDOT uses on toll facilities. So you can use transponders or pay by license plate. But it's at the terminal ticket booth locations. Advanced ticketing is basically buying a ticket in advance of arriving to the terminal. And you can do that today, but this would take it, looking at it as either getting a higher level of participation in that or requiring it in its entirety, which then should streamline the processing at the terminal.
Okay, so with which one can a driver avoid the queue?
None.
Do you mean, I guess for Judy, can you be more specific about the
So
queue?
that a driver doesn't need to be in the long line waiting to go through the toll booth. Which one of these gives that driver the option of getting out of that line and going right onto the dock.
Well, let's see. I guess I'll say it this way. So the good to go alternative as it's currently defined is, and there's some different, let's see, there's a couple different options with respect to the good to go. This definition right now is you're paying at the toll booth. So again, first in, first pay, first go on the boat is the kind of the principle there. In the case of an advanced ticketing, then vehicles would come in and still need to go in and approach the terminal in a first in, first out approach, and be confirmed that they have a ticket.
Also, I'll just jump in and say, Judy, that answer to that question is the reason that these alternatives were added, because we need to look at them to see if they would reduce the queue and how it would work operationally. And the theory is it would reduce the queue, or it would make it easier to process vehicles, but that's kind of why they need to be studied, right, Mark?
Right, because the only advantage is if it would reduce the queue.
It doesn't.
I get off.
Got it. Thanks. Scott? Scott Harvey?
Sorry, I had to get on mute.
It's okay.
You've already answered the one question to some extent about the advanced ticketing, because we already can do that. In fact, I already do that at other terminals. But my question is why wasn't good to go and advanced ticketing included in B and C? Just because we have a larger dock doesn't mean we can't use that efficiency and make it even that more efficient.
Yeah, Mark, do you want to take that?
Sure. So Scott's good question, and what we can do, and we'll be looking at as we go further, is you can pair some of these elements with the B and C. But what we would do is, as we generate in level 2 more quantifiable information, we will first and foremost understand how much benefit might be gained by an element, and then we can say, should we add it to one of the other alternatives that might also have a larger dock size, particularly if it's not meeting, the screening criteria, but there's also a lot of considerations besides just the processing they're in. Obviously, the evaluation criteria, there's dock footprint, there's cost, schedules, but there's nothing that is saying right now we don't need to add them. It's really just a matter of going through, looking at them with an 80 dock size, 80 vehicle dock size, and then basically discerning the benefits gained, and then we can mix and match.
Mark, they're still listed as supplemental elements, right, for those alternatives?
That's correct, Hadley.
All right. And David, got your hand up.
Under operational elements to consider for level 2, you list overhead loading, which I saw on basically every option. Have we determined how long it takes to load and unload without an overhead loading? And why is that such an important factor in this whole study? Also, the whole overhead loading starts adding on this whole industrial look to the element of the dock, which we're in a residential neighborhood. And one of the biggest concerns is making this dock look like it fits the neighborhood, not have some big industrial complex out there in the harbor. So have we looked at that option a lot, or is that just something you just keep throwing in there because it's an easy go-to?
Thanks, David.
Do we have time? Do we have time to discuss how long it takes to load and unload and how that affects the schedule?
Thanks for that question. I wonder if, Mark, do you want to talk a little bit more about what the operational elements, that blue box, really is, and why there's kind of the same thing on each alternative?
Yeah, let me touch on that real quick. We're just those are elements where we're saying we aren't precluding them, or it's something to consider if the other core alternative is deficient in some of the criteria that we've established. in terms of processing time, operational efficiencies, but they also come with budgetary implications, right? As well as some of the things you've just touched on, David's, that we want to demonstrate how, basically evaluate how can we achieve the operational requirements before you get to that with the core elements. And so it sits in the operational side.
When will that be addressed, and how are the deciding factors that will make that overhead loading criteria?
So that's what we're going to get to in level 2. So we're going to go in the after this level 1 phase, we're going to go into generating quite a bit of quantitative information, footprint, opinions of cost, visual considerations, environmental considerations, the traffic operations details. We'll get into quite a bit of traffic modeling, so we can basically generate information that helps us and you all understand what sort of differences might be achieved with these different alternatives. And one of the reasons, is to restate that, of why you have a variety of alternatives is so that we can better describe what the differences are to good to go with an 80 dock size, or a remote holding, or a 124 dock size. And it allows us, by having them more discrete, to generate information that shows how the differences.
Yeah, but Mark, all that you just said doesn't address why we need an overhead loading system.
Yeah, well, so we're well, obviously overhead loading does have a relation to the dwell time to load and unload a boat.
There we go, the
What we're
dwell
gonna
time.
see is
Have we
what-
studied the
yeah.
dwell time of what it takes to load and unload as it currently is?
Yes, we have that information from WSF, and then that will be fed into our traffic models, and then we can see what the differences are with these different operational enhancements.
Okay.
Thank you, Mark. By the way, nicely prepared package on this, you guys. You guys have done a nice job.
Thanks, David. And I see, Susan, you have your hand up, and then we can dive into the results of the level 1 screening, which I'm sure you're all looking forward to talking about more.
Yeah, I'll keep it brief. I wanted to just follow up on Judy's question too, because I wasn't quite sure either. With the good to go, would that be just like when we drive through the tunnel or something and we have that thing on our window and it just, I mean, it's like you don't stop, you just keep driving, that sort of thing?
Yeah, Susan, that's correct. So
Okay,
the good to go program is, you can do transponder, or you can do a register or license plate pay that way, or you can pay by mail. So the assumptions of those same offerings would be
yeah, so you don't have to stop at a toll booth, you just load as traffic permits, kind of thing.
That's correct.
Okay, and then the advanced ticketing, that's something we kind of already have, that some people use, myself included, where you buy a pass online, but you do have to stop and get screened, right?
Correct.
Okay,
correct. And
cool,
so the
thanks.
difference
I just
here
wanted
would
to
be
make sure
like,
I understood those. Thanks so much. That's helpful.
Thanks, Susan. And then for anybody who's not tracking the chat, we have a couple comments. Frank said, asked if the passenger loading information could be shared ahead of the modeling. And we will, at our next meeting, be talking about kind of how level 2 is going to work. And so we'll kind of put a pin in that and include it in our thinking about how we share information about level 2. Fletcher added that overhead loading also makes a difference for the safety of pedestrians. And John submitted a comment that I haven't seen yet. So regarding overhead loading, it would be useful to know what statistics there are on walk-on incidents due to using the vehicle ramp for loading and unloading. Thank you, John. I think, oh, Frank, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Frank.
Yeah, thanks, Lauren. I just wanted to clarify the good to go, because so what Mark, you're saying is good to go will allow you to drive through. I know that there's problems. I've heard there's problems with, passenger counts. It doesn't count passengers. It doesn't count length of vehicle. There are so many different fare structures in WSF. The good to go by itself, I just want to make sure everybody is aware of this and not to set everybody up, because I'm understanding there's large problems with good to go and implementing it in the ferry system as a drive-on type scenario. Is that correct? I just want to make sure we all are on the same page.
Yeah, Frank, thank you for that follow-up and clarification. The degree to which, so technologically today, it is difficult to electronically identify the number of people in a vehicle. Also, the fare structure today has different vehicle lengths, categories, etc. And so the degree that is going to offer an operational benefit and expediency very much will likely be related to the fare structure potentially, which then of course requires a discussion with the Transportation Commission, et cetera, with respect to other ways to simplify that and streamline that. But that's a good point, Frank, that it doesn't automatically speed things up if some of those things are kept the same.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And we have a question from Marty asking if the alternative that adds advanced ticketing means to add it as mandatory for all, so that the ticket buyer's line becomes the ticket holder's line. Is that correct, Mark?
Yeah, Marty, that would be, of course, the upper end of the operational improvement, is if you get 100% of advanced ticket requirements.
Okay. And all of these alternatives are coming up again in just a moment with findings from the level 1 screening. So there will be more opportunity to keep talking about this.
And I would just add that these types of questions and variations is specifically what the value of getting through the level 1 and into this next set of alternatives for us to go through all basically a wide variety of permutations that you're all touching on and get through the kind of the range of results that will come with that.
All right, you want to move ahead to the findings?
Sure, let's go there if everyone's ready. So yes, let's move on to the results of our level 1 screening. So just a reminder that you saw the the list of screening criteria, and at this phase we had some information we've shared previously about sailing time and frequency of sailings, and in some cases we didn't have quantifiable information. We were basing our assessment on the professional experience of Washington State Ferry staff, consultant staff, input from the community advisory group in past meetings, as well as the technical advisory group. And so that's what we're going to reflect here and in the results that I'm going to go through. So here's what this looks like in a matrix. Don't expect that you all have the report. Don't expect you can read the across the top and down the column. Across the top are the alternatives going from left to right, A1 through C and into the D through I. Down the left side of the screen is the various screening criteria. And so things that a box where an alternative is color-coded green, that our assessment is that alternative had a high likelihood of being able to satisfy that criteria. Where it's yellow, our assessment is that alternative had a moderate likelihood of being able to satisfy the criteria. And where it is orange/red, our assessment, based on all that information put in, is that the alternative would have a low to no likelihood of being able to satisfy the criteria. So just at a quick glance, you can see that each of the alternatives has at least one criteria where we, in our assessment, see that it has a low likelihood of being able to satisfy the criteria. But as you go to the right side of this screen, you'll see that alternatives D, E, F, G, H, and I all have quite a number of categories where we don't think that they would be able to satisfy the criteria. So, getting to the punchline here, alternatives D, E, F, G, H, and I were saying that they are not going to pass through level 1. Those are the those are the alternatives that all remove the terminal to a location besides its current location. As you recall, in our previous meetings, there was a general consensus that those alternatives should not proceed through level 1, but you all wanted to see us go through the criteria, the expanded list of criteria, assess them, and show our homework. And so that's what we're doing here. And then the alternatives that are on the left, A1 through A7, which are all 80 dock size at the current location, paired with the different operational enhancements. B and C, which are 124 dock size and 186 dock size, are all going to go into level 2. And with that, we'll go through, here's what that looks like, basically just in a list format. Just reiterating what I just said, all the alternatives that are shown in bold text are going through, and then those that are shaded out are not proceeding past the level 1. And then in a moment, I'm now going to go through each one of them with a high level comment about the main item of why that alternative, the one area where it might have scored in a low likelihood, but is going to give us a place to kind of focus our attention in a lot of ways going forward about how we could maybe address that. So let's see here. Let me get myself oriented here. So this is A2. Oops, lost my place in my notes here. My apologies. So A2 is replacing the dock at the same size and location with good to go. And the main consideration from a low likelihood category is that we need to, again, assess the benefits, which was some of the comments and questions you were all asking just a few minutes ago. Oops, sorry. We jump back here for a second. I'll start over. Here's A1. This is replacing the dock at 80 cars in the same location, no operational elements. So this meets many of the core elements of the purpose and need and the evaluation criteria. The one thing that it's on the lower end, at least right now, is on the operational efficiencies because it doesn't have any added operational elements. So we'll go to A2. Here's A2, same dock size, same location with the good to go fare payment added. Obviously, as we just talked, there's some different permutations in terms of how much benefit adding this would be if fare structures stay the same. And it's a policy change and requires both funding potentially, as well as legislative authorization and a discussion with the Transportation Commission to advance this. Go to the A3. So A3 is replace the dock at the same size and location and add advanced ticketing. So this has, again, similar to the good to go alternative, would require an assessment of the policy change to do such a system, and that could affect the project schedule. So A4, you've seen this one before. This is replace the dock and add 2-lane holding on Fauntleroy Way, which, as a reminder, would require that Fauntleroy Way be made one way in the northbound direction. This one, the thing that would need to be assessed and evaluated further here is that obviously that traffic circulation requires coordination with the Seattle Department of Transportation. It has some discussion with the community, and also we heard from the technical advisory group that the ability to integrate transit close to the terminal in this one is not real apparent, and so that would fall, right now it falls on the lower end of being able to satisfy the operational efficiency criteria in the circulation of the circulatory impacts evaluation criteria. So A5, sorry, I had a pop-up on my Zoom call here, so let me just get out of the way. A5 is replacing the dock and allowing basically approach from either direction depending on your destination. Obviously, this too, similar to the previous alternative, affects circulation, and so that would require some coordination with Seattle DOT, discussions with the community and neighborhoods, and could affect the project schedule. Go to all A6. So A6 is same dock, same location. This adds remote holding, generally in an area up around 45th and Fauntleroy Way. So the item that this would require is purchasing of right-of-way, as well as some of the operational considerations of what it's like to have remote holding, and fare payment up at the remote holding area, and then how those vehicles go down to the dock and then are processed onto the dock. So there's some policy and potential cost and right-of-way questions with this one, but we're going to advance it and see as we get further into the quantitative evaluation how it fares. And Lauren, I see some hands coming up, so before we advance, do you want to take those now?
Sure, why not? Go ahead, Frank.
Sure, thanks, and thanks for stopping here. I see on A4, 5, and 6, and the green line is longer, yet you have 2 lanes of holding on Fauntleroy. The line is longer, yet you have, and then on A6, it's longer all the way up, yet you have a remote holding lane someplace else. I mean, I think these graphics could be updated to show what the actual effect is. If you have the remote holding for 106 cars, why is the line behind it going uphill there? And here, why is the line from the dock going up to the holding area? Because the holding area holds 106 cars. Am I wrong?
Yeah. No, Frank, you're not incorrect. What I'll say is one of these that would come out of, we will be able to affirm that when we do the operational analysis traffic modeling. But the one other thing to that I think we're denoting here is that how you have vehicles arrive first in, first out from remote holding and how they get down to the terminal, there may need to be some lane to account for how they do that, so they're not mixed with the other traffic that's not headed to the ferry terminal. But that's something we need to investigate further with these types of options.
Yeah, I just think if you
So
can
it could shorten up. More than likely, would definitely shorten up, but there may also need to be a lane that is
understood,
partially designated. So yeah.
But if
Right,
you could
maybe, I think that in the spirit of your comment, it's a good comment that maybe we could color code these in a slightly different way when we're meaning that the shoulder is where they're being held versus where we'd be using it for ferry traffic. Mark, we could talk about that, a different way to use a different color or hash mark it or something, because I think Frank's saying that you wouldn't have the queue there necessarily, but it would still be used for vehicles to get to the terminal.
Right. All I'm just saying is if you're going to use a visual, the visual should be consistent throughout.
That's helpful.
Yep. Okay.
Thanks.
Thank
Victoria?
I live at 45th and Trenton, and I'm trying to picture where this holding line would be at 45th and Fauntleroy. Have you actually looked at the streets? Because if I'm picturing this correctly, that's a very narrow street.
I think it's a typo. It's 47th and Fauntleroy, which is the gas station lot. That's what's intended.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
It's shown here in the red box there.
Oh, so you would take over the gas station is what you're proposing in this scenario. Is that correct?
I think the way to think about this, Victoria, is it's a representative location. Just it has been suggested in past public comment. We would, before we'd go down that further into that, we'd assess what's the benefit of looking at something like this, and where's a location that would be conducive to that. You get into budget considerations, cost, and the cost of the parcels,
Okay.
etc. And is it valuable? So think of it as it being a representative location.
I think that the header is a typo and that the slot that's been suggested is 47th and Fauntleroy, as that third bullet under the green box shows.
Yeah, that's correct, Hadley. That is a typo.
Yeah. I don't think anybody suggested 45th. Victoria.
Okay. Marty?
Hey, so just another question on this one. It's always been a little confusing to me, and Hadley has been really nice and trying to help me understand. But Mark just mentioned that fare collection might happen there, and that I haven't heard in any other statements. So is that something that you're thinking about for the remote holding areas, or is that did I hear that incorrectly?
No, you did not hear that incorrectly, Marty. I did say that. I think there's a scenario of this with fare processing still happening, fare payment and processing still happening at the terminal, and just a remote holding area. There's also a scenario you could envision of having it at the remote holding area that then, similar to advanced ticketing, the processing is expedited near the terminal.
Thank you. And then one more. I certainly can understand it if the fare processing is going on there, and then the processed vehicles go ahead and join the queue wherever it is, and everybody has their ticket before they get onto the dock. What I don't understand is if there's no fare processing there, since you still would have a whole lot of other vehicles that had pre-purchased their ticket online and were in the queue, and how could you hold people there and have them feel like they were first on? Is that just for a level 2 question, or is that, it's just a basic, I don't understand how that might work.
Yeah, no, the principle of first on and first off, that has to be considered as, how that's exactly one of the things we have to detail in with this option as it goes forward, is how does that look? Does it work based on where vehicles are coming, where a remote holding might be? And this may be a good time that I'll just note that while we're saying these alternatives are going into the level 2 for that discussion, as we develop information, we may find that the item that we've assessed as a low likelihood of meeting criteria is continuing to be in that state and doesn't look like it's ever going to get any better. And we have options that are alternatives that are better. And so there's nothing saying that we can't think about basically just screening out an alternative earlier in the process of level 2 as we investigate that.
And one more while I have you, and that is that as we were wrestling through A1, 2, 3, 4, I had some other comments or different things, but I felt like we were just going to be going through this all and not stopping at each one and commenting. Is that right? Or are we going back through these later? Or if you had concerns about, some of the other holding lanes or traffic directions, do you want that information now?
So we are stopping kind of at the end of this series that are all variations on the 80 vehicle dock right now. So this would be a fine time if you have questions about any of the earlier alternatives to ask about them. But we'll also be going through the rest of the alternatives, B and C, that are advancing to level 2, and there will be another pause for questions after that if you'd rather see all of the alternatives before going back to comment on any of the earlier ones.
Okay, I've had a chance to look at the alternatives. I guess I'd like to say thank you very much for putting in the processing alternatives for A2 and 3, and I think they deserve a lot more study. I think A4, which has the 2 holding lanes on Fauntleroy, would eliminate rapid ride and would also eliminate or make it very difficult for any of the residents to get into the driveways if you have 2 holding lanes in front of your driveway. And the A5, which has 2 different directions, again adds complexities to keeping our rapid ride, and big modalities are public modalities are very important. And that brings us up to A6, where we are right now.
Thank you, Marty. Does anyone, I see a question also from John Wright, asking if there are any terminals that currently have remote holding.
Leonard, do you want to jump in on that one? Put you on the spot. Where else we use remote holding?
There we go. Finally got off of mute. Kingston for one. There's several that have holding lanes going up to them, but Kingston's probably the first one I can think of offhand to where we actually manage traffic remotely before sending them down to the lower dock.
And Leonard, can you just Mark, can you just add that that is still a first in, first out operation? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, the way the WAC or the process that we've been working with, it's first come, first serve, right? So everybody would enter through the remote holding. This is how it works at Kingston, or how we're proposing it to work at Kingston. There's a project on the table right now that uses license plate recognition. Everybody has to enter that shoulder holding lane. Once the lower vehicle lot is full, cars are then held prior to the local community there, and then they're pulsed down to the dock as we can process them. So you may say in 6 at a time or 10 at a time, process them and fill the dock. You have to figure that number out based on, how soon your next boat arrives and the processing rates. But still, everybody's first come, first serve. And so the license plate recognition, if you come in from a different access point and cut off 100 vehicles that have been waiting, the ticket sellers would be notified that that license plate was not verified through that process or that remote holding area. And Hadley mentioned Friday Harbor is another one where we have remote holding. I'm not good on the spot.
That was great. Thank you.
Sure.
I know. Sorry to call on you, Leonard, but I knew you knew the answer.
No, that's okay.
All right, thanks, Leonard.
Great.
So are we ready to go to A7?
Sure. Let's go to A7 and then do B and C, and we'll stop again so that we can get comments on the whole set.
Sure. Okay. So A7 is another remote holding option. This time it's suggesting to use the parking area at Lincoln Park. It has the considerations that we just talked about in A6, but in addition to that, obviously because it's proposed to be using the parking lot, it has some additional coordination and permitting requirements that would further lengthen the timeline to kind of work through this alternative compared to A6. So let's go to alternative B. So B is the current terminal location, but this has the dock size increased to 124 vehicle capacities. As was discussed earlier, this can be paired with some of the operational elements if we find that that's of a benefit to do based on going through the quantitative evaluation in level 2. It does require, obviously with the dock expansions, coordination with partner agencies and permitting agencies. And then we'll go real quick to C, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So alternative C is same terminal location with 186 vehicle capacity dock. Again, operational elements could be added to this. In addition to the permitting and coordination requirements that came with alternative B at 124, this terminal footprint has the potential of impacting Cove Park, which is an additional aspect of the permitting complexity.
Okay. Thank you, Mark. So now, before we move on to the alternatives that are not advancing to level 2 and talk a little bit about those findings, do others have questions about alternatives A1 through A7, alternative B, or alternative C? And I see already a comment from John in the chat saying that his concern with remote holding would be maintaining the integrity of the line. The distance from 47th and Fauntleroy to the terminal creates a lot of opportunity for people to cut the line. I was not aware ferries utilize license plate recognition technology. Thank you for that information. Thanks, John. And again, just reiterating that alternatives A through 7, alternative B, and alternative C are moving into level 2. And so all of the questions that have come up about holding and about fare processing, there are also some messages in the chat about good to go earlier, that's all going to get run through in level 2, and we'll have other meetings. Our next few meetings will be getting your input and preparing to go into level 2 screening. So just want to make sure that's abundantly clear. And Scott, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. I have several comments. The first on the good to go, as is normally run throughout the state here, I understand the inefficiencies and how it might not work on the dock there. And I do understand the situation as far as collecting the fares for the passage and such. What I would recommend that we consider basically a situation like they have Nexus going into Canada, in the fact that you would have a situation where you would have a certain class of vehicles that were going through good to go, and other ones wouldn't be allowed to it. I would speculate, I don't know the exact numbers, but I'd like to see what the numbers are. The vast majority of the vehicles that go through that go to Fauntleroy are single individuals. And so, and I don't know whether it's 50%, 40%, 60%, but most of them only have one person in it. So if you restricted, you have two toll booths. If you restricted one of the toll booths in there to be just good to go for a certain amount. So basically you would have 50% of the load would go through really quickly on good to go, and then would switch over to having both situations here. You would have an efficiency there and an incentive for having good to go. As far as a vehicle size, the good to goes that I have here are all vehicle specific here. So basically you would buy a good to go based upon the size of your vehicle. So you wouldn't have an issue whether you had a 14-foot or a shorter vehicle in there. So that's another way that you could all handle that as far as good to go. Mm-hmm. As far as that's the first thing. The second thing, in both C and D, well, first thing for both B and C, excuse me. If you add a second level, you don't have to lengthen the dock. You can put 124 cars on that 80 vehicle dock with a second level. You only have to put 44 cars on a second level here, and there's plenty of room for that second level there, and you would not extend it. Furthermore, if you had a second level there, you wouldn't have to expand on 186 vehicle dock as well. I'd like to have that added as far as alternatives are concerned here, because there's a lot of concern about the dock expanding here, but the 124 would be an easy fix. You put 44 cars over the 80 cars that you already have on the dock. Those are my comments. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. And I hope, Mark, you wrote all those down to add to the alternative process in level 2, because this is exactly the kind of detail that we'll be fleshing out in the alternatives that are advancing forward. And that's exactly why we are advancing those alternatives, to figure out what is the best way to include them that would have the most impact. And I'm going to ask, so Laura is running the slides. Laura, can you go back to that matrix slide while we have this conversation, so we can kind of get that full list of the alternatives so y'all can see what those are? I know it's quite small, but it's someone trying to speak. All right, Marty, do you want to go ahead?
So in any case, I'm just a minor comment about the graphics. Those green lines that you have that go up are lines that say, where do we get to 186? Where do we get to the 1.5 times vehicle capacity? But it's not where the queue ends. And in the way that you might present this to the community going forward, a unskilled observer would look at those and say, oh, that's the end of the queue. So if we picked this particular plan C, for instance, we would have no queue at all on the street. And I really want you to think about your graphics and try to figure out how you can show this is where we get to get our 186, which is the metric we have. But it's not, I mean, every single one at peak demand will have a queue. There will be a queue.
Thank you. I'm not sure what that audio was, but I'm sorry about that. We've got comments in the chat. Victoria first asked, would A7 require taking parkland and all the complications that go with it, as well as affecting the disabled parking spaces? Mark, do you happen to know A7, does that require additional right-of-way?
It's let's see, just make sure. A7 is the basically it's a reconfiguration of the existing parking lot. So it's not well, it would require, I guess the short answer is it would require, as we think at this point, it would require a very similar level of coordination and as though you were, because it's a change in use to park property, right? And there's going to be questions, concerns about doing that. So I would suggest that it is on the similar timeline of discussion for that kind of proposal.
Thank you. Does that answer your question, Marty?
That was Victoria's
question. Oh, I'm sorry. Victoria, does that answer your question, Victoria?
Well, somewhat, because if you take it for holding, you take the parking lot to hold cars, then people can't park there to use the park. So in my mind, that is taking park land. And then there's I forget the federal rule about taking parkland, but it seemed we would get into that.
Yeah, that's definitely what we would get into, and what we'd be working with our technical advisors on as well.
Yeah, just that's criteria that talks about 4F, 6F. Those are the federal subsets of the federal regulations that you're referring to.
Helen is also asking if there's any motivation to obtain private property adjacent to the dock to facilitate expansion and modernization. Is there a specific alternative that you're asking about, Helen, or is that just generally for any of the alternatives?
Any of the alternatives, just occasionally private property does come up for sale. I don't think there's anything recent, but I mean, it's a very limited footprint we're currently working with. So, I mean, there is some small amount of private property next to the dock. And so just, has it ever occurred to obtain that?
I'm wondering if is that a Mark question? I'm trying to think about who would best answer that, or Hadley.
Well, I can start, Mark, you can correct me, but none of the alternatives we're showing now have a footprint over private property next to the terminal.
Would it ever be a consideration to obtain, a slightly larger amount of land to approach it, but not encroaching in parkland, but obtaining private property?
Marcia, do you want to jump in on this? Because my understanding is that that's why we showed alternative C with the expansion toward the direction that it's showing widening, because that's parkland. So that's a consideration, and that's why it's red on this matrix, but it's also avoids Fauntleroy Creek and the private property, residential property on the other side of the terminal.
Yeah, I think generally you have to have a good justification for why you want to expand the right of way. And if one of the alternatives, as we continue on and it gets more refined, if there's a good reason for it being better to use upland area, and if that happens to be private property, then it could be considered. In terms of the parklands, there are certain regulations about it, and there are also regulations about using private property, and both of those require a really good justification for why we want to use that, and how that showing that without using that, we don't serve the purpose of the project and how it's going to be functioning and constructed.
But there's no anticipated intensification. For instance, occasionally pieces of property do come up for sale. And there doesn't seem to be an anticipation that the dock would expand. I mean, this is a very old facility, and it's very out of date. And in other areas, I mean, a highway would expand, and this is a highway that's not able to serve its current users because it's really a 1920s scale.
Well, similar to highways, there's you know, the new more Mark's bailiwick. There's, you know, more traffic theory that, you know, building wider is not really always the correct response, and that building smarter, which means using some of these operational efficiency type of programs, is what's going to be better in terms of the environment, both the community, even if private property is being put up for sale. It's not a given that we would automatically think about spreading our wings for the sake of it, because it's an older dock. There has to be good justification for it.
So I think what follows is that depending on what alternative actually is selected, that's when this sort of conversation would start becoming material.
I mean, for instance, I mean, Sound Transit needs additional facilities. Other highways, I mean, they have, you know, when they're under capacity and they're not meeting the need of the traffic that's going through there, adjustments have to be made. So, and a lot
right. And you just need to select a site before you even know if that, or select an alternative before you know if that's needed.
Yeah, but I mean, we know we have the traffic and there is the need. I mean, this is a highway and it is a means of crossing east to west. And it is, I mean, the lack of traffic signaling, the lack of facilities, the lack of access to the dock. I mean, cabs are still driving down to the end. It's incredibly, it's out of date. Mm-hmm. And so there's no anticipation for the utilization of this efficiently. So that's all.
Okay, thanks, Helen.
Thanks.
We'll get more into that and as we move forward in the process. Let's see. I see Judy and Anne, you've had your hands up for a minute. Why don't you go first, Judy?
Thank you. I will point out one very important element, which Marcia knows full well. I think her answer touched on it. This whole area is an environmentally critical area. You're talking about in the creek buffer, which has 100-foot buffer. I mean, if you owned a home there and wanted to enlarge it, you could not, because it's in the creek buffer. And I suspect, I don't know for sure, but I suspect any kind of facility would have to follow the same stipulations about what you want to do. My question is it fair to assume that the alternatives that present a really stiff slog up a very steep hill will fall off very soon in level 2 screening, such as taking parkland? Is it fair to assume that these will drop off soon?
Mark or maybe Marcia, do you want to take that one? In terms of how screening works related to environmental concerns.
Well, I'm just pointing out that some of these are still pie in the sky. You've added a screening criteria related to parkland, yet that alternative is still on here.
Right, and it's yes, I understand, yes. So it will be advancing into level 2 where there will be much more criteria related to environmental and other community impacts, park impacts. And so we'll talk more about kind of how the level 2 process will work and at what point you'll be expecting to see different criteria come up. So I don't know that we can actually answer that question at this point, but it's a really, I understand the question, and
Okay.
we'll get into that in the next meeting, I think.
Yeah,
Thank
and Marty, this is Marcia. I would say that, you know, your pie in the sky analogy is good metaphor for where we are. Everything is really at the 50,000 foot level. And so at that stage, looking at the questions about parkland and the different types of regulations, you get one answer. But the further we refine these alternatives and think about, you're able to also refine how you look at their impacts and to what degree those regulations affect the outcome. So it's not really quite a given yet that those are going to drop out as soon as level 2. It's just that at each stage, you've got more refined questions to ask and to see how that they balance out amongst the rest of them.
Thank you. That's great.
Thanks, Judy. Go ahead, Anne, and then I'm going to start checking in with some of you that we haven't heard from yet, just to make sure that this is all making sense. So go ahead, Anne.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for all of this. It's really thorough. And my question is about operations while the dock is under construction. So I don't see any, it just suddenly occurred to me that there are no criteria for that. So is that a level 2 criteria? And then as you're looking at different options for maintaining operations on the route during construction, are there different options given for that as well?
Thank you, Anne. Marcia, do you have a sense of when the construction impacts come into play in the screening criteria?
Yeah, I think that, you know, I think level 2, we might be getting into a little bit of that. We use that, you know, the long phrasing of the word constructability, and we're thinking about, you know, what are the means and methods you might begin to construct this, but really a lot of that refinement comes into play when we get into the NEPA analysis. But level 2 is part of the stage where we begin to put that thinking cap on, but it would still be at a really high 50,000 foot level. It's not going to be as refined as it will when you move into the NEPA, into the environmental review process under NEPA.
Thank you. And does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I haven't heard from some folks, and I'm hoping that that means that this is all making sense and feeling good to you all, but I just want to check in with Anna, with Fletcher, with Greg, and let's see who else we haven't heard from yet. Do any of you have thoughts or questions that you wanted to make sure to ask? I see Fletcher, go ahead. Thank you.
I just made the note that, like, on the ability to keep the current sailing schedule, I feel like A1 may not meet that criteria, because in pre-COVID, it's like, I think I added up it's about a third of the time, like it's an hour. Oh, you know, there's an hour-long wait. So that seems like one of the kind of base reasons, you know, for looking at better operation. And then also just, I appreciated the comment about good to go being possibly a second lane where you're kind of going past the toll booth, like if you have good to go, or if you're prepaid, which is currently an option, but that just kind of allows, like, you may split right at the toll booths, but it can kind of run forward faster as other people wait in line. So I thought that was good. Those three things all kind of work together. Good to go, prepay, and possibly with any of the other options.
Yeah, and so the second lane for whoever's prepaid being the concept that we might explore in level 2 as this advances.
Yeah, and just it's like if it works, it's like somebody with passengers maybe can't take advantage of it, but other people, it could still provide some benefit. If people have, if they have passengers and they've prepaid, then they could take advantage of it, Yeah. Or if they have just the driver and good to go, they can take advantage of it. So, and that's kind of just the same, like on the narrows. It's like, if you have good to go, you can just drive through. If you have something more complex, you go to the toll booth,
Yeah, thank you for that idea. And with the A1, it sounds like your suggestion is the operational efficiency of the dock as it is could degrade further.
Well, it's just, the ability to keep current sailing schedule.
Mm-hmm.
It might be yellow, but that would be my suggestion. Yes.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much, Fletcher. Anna, how are you doing out there? Is this all making sense? Any questions?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I think this is well organized and well presented. At this point, of course, I have the ones that I think are a better idea and ones that aren't, but aren't such good ideas. But I like the idea of starting to now narrow it down and making decisions based on this information and some of the data that you're presenting. A couple things just to point out that I'm still a little concerned about as a ferry user. So I'm more on the side of, increasing operational efficiencies. I agree with someone's comment earlier about the current footprint is just too small for the current operations. I don't think widening the toll booth lane is likely, but just replacing the dock one for one, the way that I've been using the dock, I kind of still see a lot of operational issues moving forward with A1 through A6. So for example, like as a walk-on or as a driver, just having that small footprint being so confined there at the ferry dock, that's still my concern is just the operational efficiency as a user, replacing it at the same size. Even with the remote holding, I still feel like there would still be operational inefficiencies doing it that way. So.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for sharing that. And yes, you're right. There will be a lot of other opportunities to talk about kind of what you think will work versus not as we move forward. But I appreciate
it's just
your kind of initial
being practical. We only have the ferry, where the toll booth is now. It's only so many feet wide, and it's not like we can necessarily widen that. So, maybe extending the dock we would be able to create more processing area that way or something like that. So that's what I'm saying. Replacing the dock one for one size still seems like there's going to be a lot of congestion in that area, even if you do remote holding and things like that.
Got it. Thank you. Devin, any thoughts or questions? How are you feeling about this?
Yeah, I think it's nice to see it kind of all displayed out like this to kind of see some of the benefits and potential negatives of each of the options, and also see why some of the other ones are kind of off the list to move on to level 2. It's, I think, going to be really interesting to hear about the different operational efficiency pieces like good to go or potential remote holding. Something else, especially when it comes to walk-ons, which I think is interesting, is not only the overhead loading, but the idea of, say, an expanded dock. If it's, say, almost 2/3 of a football field longer, I don't know how many times misconnections have been made already on a quite long dock trying to get to the transit stops. And if we're actually trying to integrate that better, I don't know if that's going to meet those goals or not. I also don't know exactly how you would start meeting those goals, but it's just something else to start thinking about as we look at all these different options.
Thank you for that perspective of how a pedestrian actually makes a connection or between modal connections. That's definitely important. Thank you. Anyone else want to weigh in before we move on to the alternatives that are not advancing to level 2? I'm sorry, I'm feeling a little slow on my viewing of the participant list, so just jump in if I'm not calling on you. Right, Judy, there's a couple comments in the chat about good to go, the hot lanes model on 405 related to Fletcher's comment. Good to go only works by itself, says Scott. HOV works with more than one. So again, we're getting into these conversations that I promise we're going to have as we go into level 2. And Judy asks, how critical is collecting passenger fares for WSF and for accommodations on each boat? Can you explain what you mean by accommodations on each boat, Judy?
I just mean that each boat has certain amenities. You have so much seating, you have, you know, in a good year, you have food service, those kinds of, how big the restrooms are. I mean, do you need to collect the fare from car passengers to design your boats and to make ends meet?
That might be a Dave Sowers question.
Yeah, I mean, Judy, the Transportation Commission helps us set fares, and the legislature sets guidelines about fare collection. As you know, heading eastbound on this route, we collect fares for passengers. So the idea for good to go eastbound has a lot more applicability because we don't have to account for passenger fares. But Fletcher made the point, of course, it's difficult to capture that going westbound. So, I mean, there's all these, this is the beauty of this process is that, and I do want to emphasize one thing, and that is the head of ferries is our former tolling director. So Patty Rubsello, my boss, is a huge advocate for good to go and hot lanes and how that technology can be used. So you couldn't have somebody better at the helm to push along these initiatives and to try to make a pilot project of good to go work here first at Fauntleroy and then maybe expand it across the system. But we do have Coast Guard requirements. We have legislative requirements. There's a lot of, and I just kind of want to hit on it. It came up several times tonight. There's a lot of policy stuff that would have to get sorted out. And so I love all these comments. I think they're great. I'm obviously diving into the chat and giving technical feedback. I can't help myself, but we still have other people that we report to, the legislature, lawmakers, you know, the Coast Guard. And so we have to work through those things on how we collect fares or don't collect fares, and whether it's a fare for the car only that penalizes people that drive alone because they might be paying more, and then the family that throws the 10 kids in the back seat, they pay the same rate as the guy with just his dog and his mom. So all that has to be sorted out, and we can't do that tonight, but it's all good stuff, and hopefully we'll be doing that in the coming months and years as we sort this out.
Thank you, Dave. And I am going to make the difficult call to move on in this meeting from the fare processing conversation at this point, just knowing that we are going to have a lot of space to have that moving forward. And we do have other content that we want to cover tonight, including the alternatives that are not moving forward. So Marty, I just saw your hand go down. I'm so sorry. But if whatever you had on your mind comes up in a salient in the rest of the conversation, please don't let me shut you down. Just want to make sure we get to everything tonight. So I think, Mark, you have a little bit more to share here, and then Hadley's going to talk about bringing this information to the community more broadly.
Sure. So yeah, so what we're going to cover here, the last slide I'll be talking to is the alternatives that didn't advance. We touched on those earlier. We know that you know, questions may still come up for you as community members or people watching. So we just wanted to recap some of the reasons and rationale that these didn't advance. So the alternatives F, G, H, and I, those are ones that all moved the location to somewhere besides the Fauntleroy area, and those all had would result in increased sailing times and decrease the frequency of sailings. So didn't meet the kind of service levels that we think are necessary for the triangle route. The South Lincoln Park and Lowman Beach locations require either right-of-way, reconfiguring local streets to create ferry access, and also have likely result in fewer transit connections. So for those reasons, those aren't being advanced. Coleman Dock is obviously a very busy ferry terminal today, and so then running another route into it, in addition to it being a longer sailing time and frequency impact for the triangle route, it also has would have an impact to the ferry service that currently goes over to Coleman Dock, therefore impacting that service and also requiring extensive coordination to figure that all out. So for that reason, that's another reason that one's not advancing. And then for other locations in Southwest Elliott Bay, Burien, and Des Moines, those also have added overall project costs, building a brand new terminal. They have effects on the project schedule, and as well as permitting and coordination complexities with multiple partner agencies for the variety of reasons that are listed below there in the bullets. And this information is all summarized in the report that you all have, if you can always refer back to it.
All right, thank you. And again, this is that information is important for you as community members who will be talking to your fellow community members about this process. So I want to make sure you understand that. And so we have a little bit more time. Any questions about the alternatives that are not advancing into phase 2? Again, we have a conversation about good to go happening in the chat and about options for transit getting on the dock. And all of this is as these move into level. I'm sure everybody's very tired of hearing us say it, and we'll see it in level 2. But really, we'll be looking at fair processing very soon. So any questions about the alternatives that are laid out or the alternatives that are not advancing into level 2? Are there any chat messages that I have missed that you would like to make sure we talk about? Let's see. Susan says, can our current boats accept overhead loading of passengers? So the 3 124 passenger Issaquah vessels, boats, can they accept overhead loading of passengers already?
That's a yes.
Okay, yes, they can. Thank you. Judy, I saw your hand go up and then it went down again. Is there anything you want to share? Okay. All right. Again, I'm trying to table that fair processing conversation so we can have it more robustly when we have all the right information to share with you. And I think we're at a place where we can turn it over to Hadley to talk about community engagement.
Thanks, Lauren. So as you know, we've been saying we're going to go back out to the broader community for a while now, and we've kind of been pushing it out as we work through some of these conversations with you. And we think we're at a point now where it's really appropriate to do the broader community engagement that we've been promising all along. and to start to bring some of this information to your communities and the general public. So we're really excited to hear the input from the community. Our last round of public outreach was in spring 2021. I think many of you participated. That was before the community advisory group was even formed. We had some introductory public meetings at that time, but there's obviously been a lot of progress since then, and you all have done a lot of work as representatives of your communities. So that's why we wanted to talk to you today. One of your key roles as CAG members is to sort of help be that two-way conversation between your communities and us and Washington State Ferries and the project team. So this is one of those times where your input's going to be really valuable. We plan to hold 2 virtual community meetings, so online meetings that will be held on Zoom, similar to your meetings like these, but for the broader public. And these will be opportunities for anyone to ask questions and interact directly with the project team. Many of you, I think, have attended some of our system-wide community meetings that we hold twice a year. They'll be structured in a similar way. We're also going to be holding an online open house, which is an open house sort of hosted on the web where people can go to the information at any time and click through the slides and click through the information and read it at their leisure and then leave comments and feedback. That online open house will be live from May 18th to June 13th. So there's 2 different ways for people to learn the information and ask questions and provide comments. We're hoping that will give everyone who's interested a chance to get what they need from this process. Our goals for the outreach are to provide information so that communities understand the challenges with the existing terminal and what WSF needs to consider when preserving and upgrading the terminal. So that's really the purpose and need of the project that you all worked closely on several months ago. Share information about the Pell process and the purpose and need statement and the level 1 screening process, so everyone understands where we're at in the process. And a key message that we're still, even though we're making progress, we're still very early on in the overall life of the project and making a final decision and beginning construction. And so we want people to understand where we're at in the overall process. We want to gather community input on issues that we should be considering and potential impacts of this set of alternatives, and sort of surfacing any issues that maybe haven't come up among the community advisory group so far. And we also want to share information about how community members can stay informed and involved as we get moving forward through the rest of the Pell process and then into NEPA and design and construction, all the future phases. Make sure people have a way to get on our list and bring their information forward. So to do that, we're going to use a lot of different methods to get the word out about this round of engagement. Most of these will be familiar to you all: our website, our notifications to elected officials and our Ferry Advisory Committee members, emails, press releases, social media, our weekly Washington State Ferries newsletter that goes out every Thursday from Patty Robstello, rider alerts, which are the text alerts or email alerts that customers can subscribe to and get about service impacts and other upcoming opportunities to engage with ferries. We'll hand out flyers at kind of peak commute times at the terminal. The video screens on the ferries will run a brief notice of the public meetings, and we're going to be providing briefings to community organizations. We have a meeting scheduled with the Vashon Maury Island Community Council in a couple weeks. And we've spoken with Frank and Mike Day and others about getting on the agenda for the Fauntleroy Community Association, one of their upcoming meetings, which we've been doing fairly regularly. And we'd love to hear from you any other groups that we should go and speak to, which is a chance to run through some of the information and have kind of a smaller conversation. Transportation Coalition, West Seattle Transportation Coalition is another one that we have talked to in the past and happy to go back to if you think that would be helpful, Victoria and John. So tonight we wanted to enlist your help to contribute to this process and get ideas from you on how we can get as many people as possible to get engaged at this step. We also want to provide you with materials as much as you'd like to share this information through your own networks and channels. We're happy to provide you the tools that you want to share this information. You're kind of our ambassadors in the community. We also welcome you to send any personalized emails to groups that you're involved in or represent. We're happy to provide that text to you, or you can write whatever you want. Posting flyers in your neighborhood. We will print out a bunch of flyers and leave them at the Fauntleroy terminal with the terminal supervisor, and you're welcome to pick them up and share them in the community. Judy has already reached out and asked for an article for the next edition of Neighbors, the Fauntleroy Communities newsletter. So any other way that you want to help get the word out and encourage people to participate, we're happy to support that. And we wanted to get your input both on ways that we can notify people about this round of outreach and how we structure this round of community engagement. And then specifically input from you would be really helpful about what information do we want to highlight at the upcoming community meetings. It's been a long time since we had the last round of meetings and we've covered a lot of material. So it'd be nice to hear from you of all of that material and all the sort of the key points and the decisions and the screening that we've done, what you think is kind of most important to share at this point based on what you're hearing from your communities. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Lauren to kind of help facilitate this conversation. And I'm happy to answer any questions about the community engagement and looking forward to hearing your comments.
Thanks, Hadley. Laura, can you advance it? Yeah, there we go. So here are kind of the key questions that we have for you about how we can best be reaching out to your neighbors and other community members. And since community outreach is obviously very centered on physical communities and it's going to be different for every community, I would like to ask kind of focus on each community that's represented here in this group separately. So I would like to start by posing these questions, whichever question feels alive to you, particularly the what information would be most helpful to share. Question to our members who are representing Vashon Island first. And so if any of you have any thoughts on what would kind of be the most helpful information to share to community members in Vashon about the process up until now to help everybody just kind of know where we're at and be able to weigh in on issues that are important to them. Scott?
I think the most important thing is just the alternatives, that we're down to this. We're going to consider all these alternatives here, and based upon what you think is important for the transportation for Vashon and whatever else here, what do you think is important? And so I think that would be very useful to the community.
Okay, so focusing on the alternatives.
Yes.
Okay. Let's see, Susan, go ahead.
I would agree with that as well with Scott, but I'd also say, I don't know if this information really is in what we've seen yet, and maybe it is just too early, but I feel like Vashon folks are most interested in what's going to reduce their commute time the most and how much wait time they have over in Fauntleroy on the dock or on the in the queue. So I don't know, like there was a comment really back in our about the graphics and maybe using different hatching and stuff. And so maybe one could be like, this is the regular queue and this is the overflow queue, or I don't know, but I know people over here, you know, how much time we spend sitting over there, you know, waiting is a big component.
Okay, so if there are any details or specifics that we can pull out in our presentation of the alternatives, that would be helpful. That's what people are going to be asking about.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, okay, great. David, go ahead.
So have we published any articles in the Beachcomber over there on what we're doing?
I don't know off the top of my head. Hadley, do you know?
I'm trying to think back to if they've covered this. I believe they covered it early on when we did do a presentation to the community council. They are on our media distribution list, so they've gotten all of our email listserv announcements and the press releases we send out about the last round of community engagement, and they will get the press release we send out about this one, but I don't recall any recent stories.
Yeah, I think that's a good media to reach out to a lot of the people on the island. And we also have a radio station over there that you might want to
Yeah.
contact. And
Yeah, Voice of Vashon is also
we should
on our
ask
media
on,
list.
and although, you know, that's, I don't know if they get into that particularly, but I would suggest at least start with those two as a starting point. So
That's a good point. We can do some targeted, I'll send the press release to them, but also maybe do a targeted phone call.
thank you.
Let's see, who else do we have on from Vashon? Helen, do you have any thoughts or suggestions?
Well, I do think, basically Beachcomber and Voice of Ashland are pretty much the contact points. We don't have small neighborhoods too much. I'm sure there are some. I don't happen to live in one of them, but yeah.
Okay, great. Do you think flyers would be effective if we got them out in the town center?
I think it would have limited effectiveness. Again, people, it's not so much a walking community, so.
Okay. And Susan is asking if we'll be sending an email with sample briefs for social ahead of the meeting. Are you, Susan, just to make sure I understand, do you mean like kind of a pre-written post that you could share out on your social networks?
Yes, I think it'd be really helpful, probably for all communities, but maybe, I don't know, just to have like something that I could just post on Facebook, or, something that I could send out to my next door email listserv, and, just that sort of thing. And as far as the flyers go, I think like little posters that we could put up at coffee shops in the grocery store could be useful. So.
Okay, great, thank you. And Fletcher brought up handing out flyers to cars traveling on the ferry. I'm trying to remember if that's part of the plan yet, but that's a great point. That's kind of a captive audience.
Yeah, that is part of the plan. It was on the list previous slide. And for the social media question, Susan, definitely we can send you that. We'll be posting on our social media channels, and we'll share those posts with you, and you can share them far and wide, and we'll share some content too.
David, did you have another thought?
Yeah, there are several places where you could put out flyers, the IGA, the Thriftway over there. There's 4 or 5 major shopping areas where you could put flyers for everybody to take, or post the police so people could see them when they're going through town. So it's worth a try.
Okay, thank you. Anne, did you have a comment about reaching out at Vashon?
Yeah, also the library might be a good place to put things up. The thing that I'm thinking about actually is trying to find a way. I'm not sure that people would really take the flyers and read them. There's lots of stuff that gets thrown out when it gets handed to you on paper. What about signs on the dock, both that would be visible to people who are waiting in the line, and also maybe on the back side of the toll booths? There's almost always a fairly large queue just to leave the dock, especially in the morning, weekdays, and putting them up there, seeing if something could be put up along Fauntleroy so that when people are waiting in line, they could see them as they're approaching the terminal, maybe with a QR code on it so that people could scan it and get to the webpage easily.
Yeah, thank you, Anne. Helen? Oh, was your hand? Your hand must have been up from before.
Sorry, but if one were to give out flyers, when people are purchasing multi-ride tickets, they're clearly regular users of the ferry system. So those would be an optimal target.
Multi-ride tickets. Okay. Yeah, thank you. All right. If you Vashon folks have other ideas, please send them our way. I am going to move on to our Fauntleroy community and check in and see if there's any specific information that you think we should highlight at the community meetings that your community in particular would be interested in. Frank?
I guess I would ask a question. If we're going to, by I guess by tonight, you've already decided what you're going to put forward and what you're not going to put forward, the B, C, or the C, D, E, and F, options. Are those going to be part of the meeting? Are you going to present that information?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Just wondering if that's going to be bringing up a, kind of just raising a question again that has to be dealt with. If that's been taken off the plate because of reasons you've identified, I guess you probably need to give people the visual that you've addressed it. And so maybe that's a good, that table would be a good way to identify that and let people know at least you addressed it, at least you thought about it.
Right. So making sure that we have include the alternatives that aren't advancing forward and explain why, and then explain what the findings are of the other ones. That makes sense. Thank you. Victoria or Marty or Judy, any thoughts on what is the most important information to focus on, or just thoughts and ideas on how to get the word out?
Well, I shared with you that the transportation group is very interested in having you come out, but I think in some of the ones that are moving forward, the alternatives, they still have some pretty high bars to pass. And I think when you're speaking to the community, those should be stressed a little more, because it's easy for people to say, oh, just line them up or make it 2 lanes without really understanding the complications that could ensue if you were to pursue that. I just feel like those are on the table still, but they have so many high bars to reach that I don't see them advancing forward very much longer.
Okay, so where you see a yellow or a red in the matrix, really explaining what that's about and what the barrier should be. Okay. John?
I think one of the things to recognize too is that the sort of the West Seattle constituency isn't monolithic. I mean, you've got the people that are down, the Fauntleroy community that's down, by the dock and living with it day in and day out, and then there's people that are users that don't have the same concerns and in fact might favor, I guess, perhaps might be more aligned with the Vashon or Southworth communities that are would since they don't have to deal with it every day, more interested in the efficiencies. And I think from the West Seattle standpoint, making sure that we reconcile, recognize that that there are that difference that the folks. I mean, like I said, the Fauntleroy community has actually got to deal with this thing day in and day out, even if they're not necessarily benefiting from it. It's there, and
Okay. So making sure we appreciate and incorporate the variety of perspectives that are out there on the West Seattle side as we're preparing information and going out to communities. Thank you. Marty?
Yeah, I think I would just like to turn it into how do we make it a win for all 3 communities? And I would like you to stress how important it is for you to be looking at increasing throughput, that that you have the same 3 boats, the same size boats, and the same schedule for the next 20 years. That's what the long range plan calls for. And so how do we increase the throughput? And which one of these alternatives gets the people home to Southworth and Vashon the fastest? And it's the one that fills the dock as fast as the boat can load. You talk about a person talked about earlier about, well, I just see it as so inefficient and it's so 1920s. Well, it's 1950s, but on top of that, it's it will always feel inefficient if you don't keep the schedule going. And some of these things do incremental changes to schedules. I also feel like it's important, but some of these do like major changes to schedules and how well we can stay on the schedule. The second thing I would say is to get them to focus on, we are really just deciding during peak demand, where do we store the cars? We're not deciding how we can get them over faster. We're deciding where we store them. Do we store them over water or do we store them on the land? And which part of the land? And so that would be the way I would try to look at these options that you're giving to Fauntleroy. And Fauntleroy also is very sort of concerned about safety. And we have excellent safety. I mean, there really hasn't been, I can't find it, maybe you can, but I can't find where this has been a collision area that's extra and et cetera. And so the safety record's good. I would also ask you to emphasize that this dock, which has the most sailings of any in your entire system, is also the one that has the most number of on-time arrivals. And it's the dock that's already the longest in the entire system, and it's second only to Coleman in the amount of overwater coverage. So there's a lot of factors in each of these things that I'd like to see at the meeting when you meet with the community, that are all part of how do you choose what would you vote for.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing is a lot of kind of how we set the stage, how we frame what the parameters are, what our goals are around that win-win.
Right, and they're very good goals. Their goals are to try to serve all these communities, make this highway as efficient as possible, and how well you've been doing and how well you're going to be doing in the future.
Got it. Thank you, Marty. I see a suggestion Ann posted for Vashon about reaching out to the school district and having them broadcast it, and reaching out to everyone with a Wave to Go card. Thank you so much, Ann. Well, I'm sure Haley is feverishly taking notes to update our outreach plans. Let's see, moving on to the Southworth community. Anna, Fletcher, Greg, any thoughts on what information we should highlight? Go ahead, Anna.
Sure. Sorry for the background noise.
Yeah, it's all good.
A couple things that I just want to add to the information that you should add. Hold on. Talking about, what other people have already mentioned, the reasons for replacements, how we're narrowing down the options, but also include a little bit of information. I know a lot of people in the community either aren't aware that the ferry dock is being replaced, or they maybe have heard that it's being replaced, but they don't know why or how it's going to impact them. So maybe include a little bit of information about the construction schedule and also the impacts of construction as they're trying to use the ferry dock. They want to be able to understand, is this going to delay them more during construction? And then another thing that I think that my community is going to be concerned about is, again, operational efficiencies and what are we doing to try to improve that, and just, making it easier for people commuting or using the ferry regularly, I think is what, my community is going to be interested in. And then what do I need to kind of help get the word out? Someone else already mentioned it, but the first thing that comes to mind is maybe like a social media post that I could copy and paste and post it into Nextdoor or some Facebook groups. For me personally, I think that's how I'm going to reach out. I don't know if I would hand out flyers or post flyers anywhere, but I could think about it.
Okay, great. So sounds like kind of helping folks who aren't necessarily sure why they should care at this point, kind of connect the dots about what why it impacts them. And I think we can definitely do some support on social media. I also just want to commend you on a very effective that just was amazing. That worked. All right, so Fletcher, you have your hand up.
Oh, I just say that I think it's the operational efficiency is what people would be really interested in on the Southworth side. And also just there's a lot, like in terms of the ferries over here, there's a lot of interest in the passenger ferry, which is Kitsap Transit, and going to Seattle. but also on, it's like expanding the Southworth dock and in not having, and this gets out of the range of this project probably, but not having the Fauntleroy project like delay any changes to the Southworth dock. And so that's just, I think that's something that'll come up is I guess how long this is going to take, and are we waiting
Got it.
for this to finish before something
Mhm.
happen on this side?
Right. So what is the connection with other related projects in terms of timeline and then the operational efficiency piece?
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to ask actually specifically of Fletcher and Anna and Greg in Southworth, are there any specific organizations or businesses or community groups that you would suggest we go to and brief?
There's a number of groups kind of online, but that's like, there's a lot of interest in the passenger ferry. So there are people following like the passenger ferry. But that might be somebody to reach out to just kind of through those groups, because they'd be people interested, probably in the construction on the other side as well. And I can try to find some of those and maybe forward them to you.
Yeah, if anything comes to you, that would be really helpful.
Just the libraries on this side as well. I mean, it's a possibility.
Okay, great. Libraries. All right, well, we have just a minute to go, so I think we'll move into sort of our closing down here. Marty, is your hand up from earlier, or did you have another comment? Maybe it's up from earlier then. Okay. Well, thank you so much, and we'll be following up with more information and materials to support you getting the word out. So just thank you in advance for whatever you can do to help us share the news. And if you hear any questions that are coming up among your community that you don't feel like you can answer, definitely be reaching out to us. I think we can go to the next step slide here, Laura. All right. I mean, we can go to the Pell process slide. We can talk about that. So this is just, again, hopefully this is becoming familiar to you now. As you can see, we're reviewing level 1 screening results today before the public input. And we will be able to have public input on the screening results available for you to kind of see the themes at our next meeting, at which point we can also preview level 2 and start getting some of your initial input, which I understand everyone is very ready to get to, and we're excited to get there as well. So, as I mentioned at the top of the meeting, just really enjoying talking with all of you, and I appreciate all the feedback that you've been giving, and we're thinking about ways to structure our conversations at the CAG going forward, particularly as we get into the more nuanced conversations at level 2. So we'll share more about that approach at our next meeting. Any final questions before we shut down, close off, go into the rest of our evenings? All right, I just want to say thank you so much for spending yet another evening with us. It's really a gift of your time. We don't have a date for the next meeting, Fletcher, so we'll be sending that out to you when we have it.
It will be after the community engagement closes, so mid-June, something like that, June. Yeah. So we have the benefit of hearing all the feedback from that online open house and the public meetings.
Okay. And we'll also be reaching out to get a sense of what your summer schedules are like, so we can make sure to be scheduling meetings at times that work for as many of you as possible. We realize we're heading into months when folks might be gone. All right, any other questions or comments before we head out? All right.
Just thank you, guys.
Well, thank you, Holland.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
If you want to speak with me or Hadley, just feel free to get in touch with the project inbox. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Good night,
Lauren.
everyone.
Good
Good
night.
night.